What would you do if you heard laughter echo across no man's land, only to realize the enemy was mocking your weapon? One soldier fired 15 rounds in the time it took his opponent to chamber a second shot. Another watched an entire squad fall silent as a magazine's worth of leads swept their position. These are not exaggerations. These are the forgotten lessons of the M1 Carbine and the brutal awakening that shattered German confidence on battlefields from Normandy to the Ardennes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They called it a toy, a pea shooter, something fit for clerks and truck drivers but useless for real soldiers. Yet for the men who carried it into frozen forests and shattered villages, it became something else entirely. It became the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the mud. The sound of boots on cobblestone filled the pre-dawn darkness of a French village. American soldiers moved through shadows, their breath visible in the November cold of 1944. Each man carried the weight of uncertainty, the knowledge that beyond the next corner might wait a machine gun nest or a Tiger tank or simply the crack of a rifle that would end everything in an instant. Among them walked men armed not with the standard issue M1 Garand, that heavy workhorse of American infantry, but with something lighter, shorter, easier to maneuver in tight spaces. The M1 Carbine hung from their shoulders, a weapon that weighed barely 6 pounds yet carried a reputation that divided opinion sharply down the middle. Some called it inadequate. Others called it salvation. The truth, as with most things in war, lay somewhere in the killing fields where doctrine met desperation. The landscape of Western Europe in late 1944 was a shattered mosaic of liberated towns and contested hedgerows, of muddy roads choked with armor and forests that swallowed entire companies whole. The Allied advance that had roared across France after D-Day had slowed to a grinding crawl. Supply lines stretched thin. Replacements arrived green and terrified. The German army, bloodied but far from broken, dug in with the ferocity of men defending their homeland's doorstep. Every village became a fortress. Every tree-line hid snipers. Every farmhouse could conceal a Panzerfaust team waiting to turn a Sherman into a crematorium. For the infantryman, survival depended on speed, on the ability to react faster than the man trying to kill him. In close quarters combat, in the chaos of street fighting or the claustrophobic nightmare of forest warfare, fractions of a second determined who walked away and who was carried. This was the crucible into which the M1 Carbine had been thrust, a weapon designed not for front-line shock troops but for support personnel, for officers and radio men and paratroopers who needed firepower without the burden of a full battle rifle. The German infantrymen, by contrast, carried the Karabiner 98K, a bolt-action rifle that traced its lineage back to the trenches of the First World War. It was accurate, reliable, powerful enough to drop a man at 500 meters. But it was slow. Every shot required a manual cycling of the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a fresh round, reacquiring the target. 5 rounds in an internal magazine. Then a clip reload, fumbling with frozen fingers to press cartridges down into the receiver while hoping the enemy wasn't already closing in. The contrast was stark. One weapon philosophy rooted in precision and tradition. The other born from pragmatism and the demands of modern mechanized warfare. When these two approaches collided on the battlefields of Europe, the results would rewrite assumptions that had held for generations. Yet before that collision, before the mocking laughter turned to silence, there had been doubt. American commanders themselves questioned whether the carbine had any place in real combat. Its round, the .30 caliber M1 Carbine cartridge, was essentially a pistol round stretched longer, nowhere near the stopping power of the Garand's .30-06. Reports filtered back from the Pacific where Marines complained the weapon lacked punch, where stories circulated of Japanese soldiers taking multiple hits and continuing to fight. The carbine, critics argued, was a compromise too far, sacrificing lethality for convenience. But the Pacific was jungle and coral, long sight lines and desperate charges across open ground. Europe was different. Europe was rubble and shadows, staircases and cellars, hedgerows so thick a man could vanish 3 feet from his squad mate. Europe was towns where every window might hide a Mauser's muzzle and forests where visibility shrank to arm's length. In this environment, weight mattered. Speed mattered. The ability to put rounds downrange without exposing yourself to reload mattered more than stopping power at 300 yards. The men who carried the carbine into these close quarters learned its rhythm quickly. The magazine held 15 rounds, a small miracle compared to the Garand's 8-round and block clip that announced its emptiness with a distinctive ping, practically inviting return fire. The carbine was light enough to swing onto target in the time it took to flinch, short enough to clear doorways without snagging, reliable enough that mud and cold rarely jammed its simple gas piston system. It was not a sniper's tool. It was not meant for stopping charging enemies at distance. But for the ranges where most combat actually happened, where men killed each other across streets and through windows and around corners, it was increasingly proving itself far more capable than anyone had expected. The German soldiers facing these new weapons had been told what to expect. American infantry were soft, their doctrine pamphlet read, dependent on overwhelming firepower rather than skill. Their weapons were mass-produced, quantity over quality, typical of a nation that fought with factories rather than warrior spirit. The Garand was respected, certainly, its semi-automatic capability a known advantage. But the carbine? Intelligence reports dismissed it. A secondary weapon at best. Nothing that could challenge a properly trained rifleman with a Kar 98K who knew how to make every shot count. This arrogance was not entirely unfounded. German marksmanship training was rigorous, emphasizing precision and fire discipline. Their tactics, honed through years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, relied on small unit cohesion and interlocking fields of fire. A German squad built itself around the MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen supporting that base of fire. The idea that a handful of Americans with glorified pistols could disrupt this system seemed laughable. They would learn otherwise. But first, they would laugh. The village of Wassenack sat nestled in the Hürtgen forest, a place that would become synonymous with some of the most savage fighting of the entire European campaign. The forest itself was a primordial darkness, ancient trees rising so densely that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Trails became muddy trenches. Visibility dropped to meters. Artillery turned the earth into a cratered hellscape where wounded men drowned in shell holes filled with freezing water. Into this nightmare the American forces pushed in November 1944, tasked with clearing German positions that had turned every draw and ridgeline into killing zones. Among the units committed was the 28th Infantry Division, battered from earlier fighting but ordered forward nonetheless. Within its ranks were countless men carrying the M1 Carbine, weapons issued to squad leaders, to medics, to anyone whose role required mobility over maximum firepower. They moved through the forest in loose formations, every sense straining for the crack of a twig or the metallic click of a safety being thumbed off. The cold seeped through wool and canvas, turning fingers stiff and making every movement an effort. Above, the canopy blocked the sky, creating a twilight gloom even at midday. The German defenders had prepared their positions with characteristic thoroughness. Bunkers reinforced with logs and earth, camouflaged so perfectly they vanished until you were practically on top of them. Foxholes spaced to provide mutual support, each rifleman able to cover his neighbor's position. They had the advantage of terrain, of preparation, of knowing every trail and approach. They waited with the patience of men who understood that in the Hürtgen, the forest itself was an ally that exhausted and disoriented the attacker. First contact came without warning, as it always did. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the trees, shredding bark and sending Americans diving for whatever cover they could find. Rifles cracked in response, the sharp report of Garands mixing with the lighter snap of carbines. Shouts echoed through the forest, voices calling for medics, for ammunition, for someone to flank that goddamn gun. The engagement fragmented into a dozen individual firefights, small groups of men trying to kill each other across distances measured in feet rather than yards. Private First Class Thomas Hendricks pressed himself against a fallen log, his carbine clutched tight against his chest. He was 19 years old, from a farm in Iowa where the loudest sound had been the dinner bell calling workers in from the fields. Now he existed in a universe of noise and terror, where death arrived faster than thought. 20 meters ahead, he could see movement, a flicker of field gray. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Between the trees. German infantry, at least 3 of them, working their way along a shallow depression that would bring them to his squad's flank. He brought the carbine up, sighting down the barrel with hands that wanted to shake but somehow held steady. The Germans hadn't seen him yet, their attention focused on the main American position. One of them, a lean man with a week's worth of stubble, carried his Kar 98K at the ready, bolt action gleaming dully in the filtered light. Hendricks could hear them talking, voices low but carrying in the strange acoustics of the forest. Then one of them laughed, a sharp bark of sound that somehow cut through the background chaos. They had spotted him. Or spotted his weapon. One of the Germans pointed, saying something to his companions that made them grin. The lean rifleman raised his Mauser, not hurrying, taking his time to acquire a proper sight picture. In his mind, Hendricks could almost hear the thought process. American with a carbine. Toy gun. No threat at distance. One shot, center mass, move on. Hendricks didn't wait for him to complete that thought. He squeezed the trigger and kept squeezing, firing as fast as he could pull and release, the carbine bucking lightly against his shoulder. The first round went wide, clipping branches. The second caught the lean German in the chest, spinning him. The third, fourth, and fifth rounds walked across the group as Hendricks swept the muzzle, not aiming so much as pointing, instinct and panic combining into a stream of fire that covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. The Germans went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment. One tried to return fire, working his bolt frantically, but another burst from Hendricks' carbine cut the attempt short. Then silence, broken only by the distant sound of ongoing combat and Hendricks' own ragged breathing. He stared at what he'd done, at the bodies sprawled in positions that spoke of violent and sudden death. His magazine was half empty. 7, maybe 8 rounds expended. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 5 seconds from first shot to last. Across the Hurtgen, across the countless small actions that made up the larger battle, similar scenes played out. German soldiers who had dismissed the carbine found themselves facing a volume of fire they hadn't anticipated. In the close confines of forest combat, where engagements happened at ranges under 100 meters, the weapon's lighter round mattered less than its ability to put 15 rounds downrange without reloading. Squad leaders who could fire and maneuver without being encumbered by 9 pounds of Garand discovered they could react faster, could suppress enemy positions while there. Riflemen advanced, could hold corridors and doorways against multiple attackers. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the tactical one. There is a particular terror in facing automatic fire, even from a semi-automatic weapon, when your own rifle requires manual operation between shots. The German infantryman, crouched in his foxhole, heard the steady crack of incoming rounds and knew that pausing to work his bolt meant exposing himself to the next bullet. The instinct was to duck, to wait, to let the storm of fire pass. But that pause, that moment of suppression, gave the American infantry the initiative. Reports began filtering up the chain of command, reports that puzzled officers who had expected the carbine to prove inadequate. Units equipped with higher percentages of carbines were experiencing fewer casualties in close engagements. Prisoners, when questioned, expressed surprise and frustration at facing what they described as automatic weapons fire from what they'd been told were inferior American guns. The mocking laughter that had greeted early encounters gave way to wary respect, then to something approaching fear. Sergeant Emil Kruger of the 275th Infantry Division sat in a cellar beneath a ruined farmhouse, cleaning his Kar 98K by the light of a guttering candle. He had been fighting since Poland, had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, had earned his Iron Cross in battles where the casualties were counted in thousands per day. He knew his weapon intimately, could field strip and reassemble it blindfolded, could estimate range by eye and adjust his sights accordingly. He was, by any measure, a professional soldier. But professionalism, he was discovering, had limits when facing industrial warfare. The Americans didn't fight like the Russians, with human wave attacks that could be broken by disciplined rifle fire. They fought with radios and artillery, with air support and armor, with a logistical system that ensured their men were fed and equipped and replaced when they fell. And increasingly, they fought with weapons that seemed designed for a different kind of war altogether, one where volume of fire mattered more than individual marksmanship. Kruger had encountered the carbine 3 days earlier, during a night patrol gone wrong. His squad had ambushed what they thought was a lone American soldier moving between positions. They had opened fire from concealment, expecting an easy kill. Instead, the American had gone prone and returned fire so rapidly that for a moment Kruger had thought they'd stumbled onto a machine gun position. 15, maybe 20 rounds in rapid succession, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, rounds cracking past close enough to feel the displacement. 2 of his men had been hit before they could properly take cover. By the time Kruger had worked his bolt and fired back, the American was gone, vanished into the night while they tended to their wounded. Later, examining the position, they'd found spent casings. Carbine rounds, not Garand. A single man with a weapon they'd been told was barely effective. Yet he'd held off 6 Germans long enough to escape, had wounded 2, and done it all with a gun that weighed less than Kruger's entrenching tool and rifle combined. The implications troubled him. War was changing, had been changing since the mechanized onslaughts of 1940, but this felt different. This was about the individual soldier, about putting capability in the hands of men who weren't frontline rifle troops. If every American squad leader, every radio operator, every support soldier could lay down suppressive fire with the speed and volume of what he'd faced, then the careful German tactics built around fire and maneuver, around supporting the machine gun and conserving ammunition, began to look antiquated. He mentioned this to his company commander, a captain who still wore the old imperial mustache and spoke of German soldierly virtues. The captain had dismissed his concerns. The carbine, he insisted, was a desperation weapon, proof that the Americans lacked confidence in close combat. Real soldiers didn't need 15 rounds when one, properly placed, would suffice. Kruger had said nothing more, but he thought of his dead comrades, of how many properly placed shots they'd never gotten the chance to fire while American rounds came back like hail. The doctrine that had served Germany well in earlier campaigns was built on assumptions about parity, about fighting enemies who used similar weapons and tactics. Against the Soviets, who often attacked with bolt-action rifles of their own, the German emphasis on marksmanship and fire discipline held validity. But the Americans were writing new rules, leveraging their industrial capacity to arm their troops with weapons that didn't require expert marksmen to be effective. A mediocre shot with a carbine, given enough ammunition, could suppress a position as effectively as a skilled rifleman with a Kar 98K. And suppression, in modern combat, was often more valuable than precision. Winter deepened across the front. Snow fell in heavy curtains, blanketing the landscape and reducing visibility even further. The fighting in the Hurtgen continued with a savage intensity that devoured divisions, but elsewhere the line shifted and stabilized, both sides exhausted, waiting for whatever would come next. In countless positions along that line, German soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes and told stories about the American weapons, about the ones that fired too fast, that never seemed to run empty, that turned every encounter into a desperate scramble for cover. The stories took on a life of their own, growing in the telling. Some claimed the Americans had developed a new automatic rifle, lighter than anything seen before. Others insisted it was simply a matter of ammunition, that the Americans could afford to waste rounds while German supply lines grew increasingly strained. A few, the ones who'd actually faced the carbine in combat, knew the truth was simpler and more concerning. The Americans had fielded a weapon perfectly suited to the warfare they were fighting, and the German infantry had no answer for it. In garrison, in the brief respites between combat, German soldiers practiced with their Kar 98Ks, trying to speed up their bolt manipulation, to shave fractions of seconds off their reload times. It helped, marginally, but there was no escaping the fundamental limitation. 5 rounds. Bolt action. Against 15 rounds, semi-automatic, the mathematics were brutally simple. In a stand-up fight at close range, the German rifleman was outgunned. Some units began carrying captured American weapons when they could, preferring Garands or even carbines to their own rifles for specific situations. This was officially discouraged, as logistical support for captured weapons was non-existent and ammunition scarce, but desperation makes its own doctrine. A soldier who survives learns to use whatever works, and what worked increasingly was putting rounds downrange faster than the enemy could return fire. The High Command, distant from the realities of close combat, continued to emphasize marksmanship and fire discipline in training. New recruits, many of them boys barely 16, were taught to aim carefully, to make every shot count, to trust in the Kar 98K as their fathers and grandfathers had in earlier wars. Then they arrived at the front, were issued a rifle and 40 rounds of ammunition, and discovered that doctrine written in peacetime manuals had little relevance when an American with a carbine was working his way through the rubble toward your position. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing for many. German military culture prided itself on quality over quantity, on the superiority of the trained soldier over the mass conscript. The idea that American troops, who German propaganda portrayed as soft and inexperienced, could achieve tactical advantages through simple mechanical superiority challenged fundamental assumptions about military virtue. It suggested that perhaps individual courage and skill mattered less than logistics and industrial capacity, that wars were won not on parade grounds but in factories, that the romanticized image of the warrior was giving way to the reality of the mechanized soldier. For the Americans, the carbine's growing reputation was a source of quiet pride mixed with pragmatism. No one pretended it was perfect. Its limitations at range were real, its stopping power inferior to the Garand. But in the situations where most killing happened, in the villages and forests and urban rubble that characterized the European campaign, it proved itself again and again. Officers who had initially been skeptical began requesting more carbines for their units. Paratroopers, who had been among the first to receive the weapon due to its light weight, swore by it. The weapon was finding its niche, not through careful planning or doctrinal foresight, but through the brutal natural selection of combat. By December 1944, as the German army launched its desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the M1 Carbine had become a fixture of American infantry combat. The Battle of the Bulge would see it tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, in sub-zero temperatures and desperate defensive actions where ammunition conservation became a matter of life and death. But that would come later. For now, in the frozen forests and shattered villages of the autumn campaign, a transformation was underway. The weapon that had been mocked, that had been called a toy and dismissed as inadequate, had proven itself where it mattered most. Not in the abstract world of ballistic tables and proving grounds, but in the mud and blood of actual combat, where the man who fires 15 times survives while the man who fires 5 times dies. The laughter had stopped. The mocking voices had fallen silent. In their place was the sound that would haunt German veterans for decades after, the distinctive crack of carbine fire, rapid and relentless, the sound of their assumptions dying round by round. December 16, 1944. The date would burn itself into memory as the beginning of Germany's final desperate gamble in the West. Through the fog-shrouded forests of the Ardennes came the rumble of tank treads and the tramp of boots, thousands upon thousands of German soldiers launching a massive offensive that caught American forces completely by surprise. The objective was audacious: punch through the Allied lines, drive to Antwerp, split the British and American armies and force a negotiated peace. For 3 days the Germans had massed in secret, hiding their preparations from Allied reconnaissance, waiting for weather that would ground enemy aircraft and give them a chance to strike without the sky falling on their heads. The initial onslaught was devastating. Entire American units were surrounded, cut off, forced to fight desperate holding actions while the German spearheads drove west. Villages that had been quiet rear areas suddenly found themselves on the front lines. Supply depots were overrun. Communications collapsed. The carefully planned Allied advance ground to a halt as divisions were rushed north to contain the bulge forming in their lines. In the chaos and confusion of those first terrible days, small unit actions became the norm. Squads and platoons found themselves fighting alone, cut off from higher command, forced to make decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. Among the units caught in the maelstrom was a rifle company from the 99th Infantry Division, positioned along what had been considered a quiet sector. They had been told to expect nothing more than patrol activity, to rest and refit after earlier fighting. Instead they woke to artillery fire that shook the earth and German infantry emerging from the morning mist like ghosts. The company commander, Captain James Whitmore, was a veteran of Sicily and Normandy, a man who'd learned to read battlefields through hard experience. He knew immediately that this was no local attack, no probing raid. This was the main effort, and his company stood directly in its path. Whitmore carried an M1 Carbine, as did most of his headquarters section. When the attack began, he'd been in the command post, a converted barn, going over supply requisitions. Now he stood in the doorway watching his defensive positions erupt under shellfire, watching German infantry advancing in numbers that made his stomach clench. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and about to be overrun unless something changed very quickly. He grabbed his weapon, checked the magazine by instinct, and ran toward the sound of heaviest firing. The first German wave hit the American positions like a hammer. These were not the exhausted defenders of the Hurtgen but fresh troops, well-equipped, advancing with the confidence of men who believed victory was within reach. They moved in squad rushes, suppressing American positions with machine gun fire while riflemen closed the distance. The Kar-98K might be slow to cycle, but in the hands of trained soldiers providing covering fire it remained deadly. Americans died in their foxholes, cut down before they could return effective fire. Others fell back, scrambling for better positions, trying to organize a coherent defense out of chaos. Private Daniel Kowalski crouched behind a stone wall that bordered what had been a pasture, his carbine pressed against the cold rock. He was 22, from Chicago's South Side, a factory worker who'd been drafted 18 months earlier. The weapon in his hands felt impossibly light compared to the situation's weight. Across the field he could see them coming, field gray uniforms stark against the snow, at least 20 men in the first group with more behind. His squad had been 9 men that morning. Now he counted 4 including himself, the others killed or wounded in the initial bombardment. The Germans were taking their time, advancing by bounds, one group moving while another provided cover. Professional, coordinated, exactly the kind of textbook assault that should overwhelm a shattered defensive position. Kowalski watched them come and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite acceptance, but a kind of focused clarity that came from knowing there was no retreat, no clever maneuver that would save him. There was only the wall, his weapon, and the distance between him and the men trying to kill him. He waited until they were 70 meters out, close enough that he couldn't miss, far enough that they might not realize how few defenders remained. Then he opened fire. The carbine bucked against his shoulder in rapid succession, spent casings arcing through the air. He didn't aim at individuals so much as sweep the muzzle across the advancing line, letting the volume of fire do what precision couldn't. The effect was immediate. Germans dove for cover, their advance stalling as they tried to identify the source of fire. Some returned shots, working their bolts, but they were shooting at muzzle flash and the crack of rounds passing overhead kept their heads down. Kowalski emptied the magazine in less than 10 seconds, dropped it, slapped in a fresh one and kept firing. Beside him the other survivors did the same, those with Garands adding their deeper bark to the chorus. For a moment, impossibly, the German advance halted. Men who had been moving with confidence now hugged the earth, suddenly aware that the position they thought broken still had teeth. An MG-42 opened up from the German side, its buzzsaw roar stitching the wall with impacts, but Kowalski had already shifted position, moving along the wall to a new firing point. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes from first shot to the moment the Germans pulled back to regroup. In that brief span Kowalski had fired nearly 40 rounds, emptying magazine after magazine in a continuous stream of fire that had single-handedly made an entire enemy squad think twice. When the shooting stopped and silence fell across the field, broken only by the moans of wounded, he realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear but from the pure adrenaline of having survived what should have killed him. Captain Whitmore found him there, still behind the wall, staring at the empty magazines scattered around his position. The captain knelt beside him, taking in the scene with an experienced eye. 20 meters out lay 2 German soldiers who hadn't made it to cover. Further back were blood trails in the snow where others had dragged themselves away. The wall itself was pockmarked with bullet strikes, testimony to how much fire had been directed at this one position. Any man here should be dead. Instead, Kowalski sat breathing hard, his carbine held loosely across his knees. They held the position for another 6 hours as the German attacks intensified. Wave after wave came on, each one pressing closer, each one forcing the defenders to give ground meter by meter. But the initial momentum had been broken, that critical first push blunted by small groups of men with weapons that let them punch above their weight. By nightfall, when orders finally came to withdraw, the company had inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. Not because they were better soldiers than the Germans facing them, but because they'd been equipped with tools that allowed desperation to translate into effective resistance. The pattern repeated across the Ardennes salient. German soldiers who had expected to sweep through demoralized Americans found instead pockets of fierce resistance, positions that should have fallen in minutes holding for hours. Much of this was due to American fighting spirit, to officers like Whitmore who refused to panic and enlisted men who stood their ground. But the weapons mattered too. A squad armed entirely with bolt-action rifles would have been overwhelmed. A squad where half the men carried carbines could generate enough fire to make attackers hesitate, to buy time, to survive long enough for reinforcements or artillery support. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded and besieged, the 101st Airborne Division fought a desperate defense that would become legend. The paratroopers had jumped into Normandy with carbines specifically because the weapon was light enough for airborne operations. Now those same weapons proved invaluable in the close-quarters urban fighting that characterized the siege. House to house, room to room, the light carbine was easier to maneuver than a Garand, faster to bring to bear when an enemy appeared around a corner. The 15-round magazine meant a defender could hold a stairwell or doorway against multiple attackers without the vulnerable pause of reloading. Corporal Vincent Hayes fought through 3 days of continuous combat in Bastogne's streets, his carbine the only constant in a world gone mad. He'd been a paratrooper since training, had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and lived through the nightmare of Market Garden. The carbine had been with him for all of it, issued the day he earned his wings, carried through every action since. He'd modified it slightly over time, taping the sling to prevent rattle, marking the magazine that fed most reliably, learning its quirks and tendencies until operating it became pure muscle memory. On the second day of the siege, Hayes found himself defending a cellar entrance against a German probe. 4 enemy soldiers had worked their way into the building through a collapsed wall, clearing rooms methodically, hunting for Americans they knew were inside. Hayes waited at the bottom of the stairs, crouched in darkness, listening to boots on floorboards above. He had 1 magazine in the weapon and 2 spares on his belt. No grenades, those had been expended hours ago. No backup, his squad scattered throughout the ruined structure. Just him and the certainty that whoever came down those stairs wanted him dead. The first German descended cautiously, rifle leading, silhouetted against the dim light from above. Hayes fired 3 times center mass, the muzzle flash blinding in the confined space. The German fell backward into the man behind him, both tumbling down the stairs in a tangle. Hayes fired again, emptying the magazine into the stairwell, then rolled sideways as return fire chewed up the position where he'd been crouched. He reloaded in pitch darkness by feel, counting rounds by touch to make sure the magazine seated properly, then waited. Silence. Then voices above, German words he didn't understand but whose tone was clear. Argument. Uncertainty. They knew someone was down there, knew at least 2 of their number were down, but they didn't know how many defenders waited or what weapons they had. The volume of fire suggested multiple shooters or an automatic weapon. The smart play was to pull back, to bypass this position and let follow-on forces deal with it. That's what they did, boots retreating across the floor above, leaving Hayes alone with the bodies on the stairs and the hammering of his own heartbeat. He stayed in that cellar for 8 hours, not daring to move, listening to the battle rage overhead and around him. When American reinforcements finally found him, he'd been sitting in the dark so long his eyes ached when they brought light. The stairs were slick with blood. Spent casings littered the floor around his position. His carbine lay across his knees, a fresh magazine inserted, though he couldn't remember doing it. They had to help him stand, his legs cramped from hours of immobility, and even then he refused to leave the weapon behind. The stories multiplied as the battle raged. In the village of Chinon, a squad sergeant named Robert Martinez used his carbine to hold off an entire German platoon that had infiltrated American lines during a night attack. Martinez had positioned himself at a crossroads, the only warning his unit had of the German advance. He fired until his barrel was too hot to touch, changing magazines by touch in the darkness, directing fire by sound and muzzle flash. When dawn came and reinforcements arrived, they found him unconscious from exhaustion, surrounded by empty magazines and dead Germans who'd gotten close enough to see his face before dying. Near the town of Clairvaux, a radio man named Eugene Park found himself the last man alive in his company command post after a direct artillery hit. Cut off from friendly forces, surrounded by German troops moving through the area, Park survived for 3 days by moving constantly, using his carbine to ambush German patrols and then vanishing before they could respond. He carried only the ammunition in his pockets, no food, no water beyond what he could find in ruined buildings. Each encounter was the same: wait in hiding until Germans passed close, fire a full magazine in rapid succession, then run while they were still diving for cover. By the time he stumbled into American lines, he'd lost 20 pounds and could barely speak, but the carbine still functioned perfectly. These were not tales of superhuman heroism but of ordinary men pushed to extremes, surviving through a combination of desperation and the tools they'd been given. The carbine didn't make them invincible. Men carrying it still died, still felt the German bullets and artillery. But it gave them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise, a way to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. German after-action reports from the Ardennes offensive noted with frustration the difficulty of dislodging American defenders from prepared positions. They attributed this to stubborn courage, which was true, but also to the firepower individual American soldiers could bring to bear. A German squad leader assaulting a position expected to face perhaps 1 or 2 automatic weapons, the Browning automatic rifle and maybe a machine gun, with the rest of the defenders armed with slower-firing Garands. Instead, they encountered what seemed like entire squads capable of semi-automatic fire, positions that erupted with a volume of shooting that suppressed advancing troops and bought defenders crucial seconds. The offensive ultimately failed. German forces, despite initial successes, lacked the fuel and supplies to sustain their drive. American reinforcements, rushed north from all across the front, contained the bulge and then counterattacked. By late January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions, having gained nothing but casualties they could not afford. The cost to both sides had been immense. Over 80,000 American casualties, nearly 100,000 German. Entire towns obliterated. Thousands of civilians killed or displaced. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Western Europe. But in the countless small actions that made up that larger battle, in the desperate stands and ambushes and close-quarters fights, the M1 Carbine had proven itself beyond any remaining doubt. The weapon that had been mocked, that German intelligence had dismissed as inadequate, had helped blunt the last major German offensive of the war. Not through any single dramatic action but through the cumulative effect of thousands of soldiers who could fire faster, move quicker, and hold positions that should have fallen. As winter gave way to spring in the Allied armies prepared for their final push into Germany, the carbine's reputation was secure. Units requested more of them. Soldiers who'd carried Garands asked to switch. The weapon had found its role, not as a replacement for the battle rifle but as a complement to it, giving mobility and firepower to men whose jobs required both. In the ruins of German cities and the final desperate battles of the Reich's collapse, it would continue to prove its worth. Oberstleutnant Hans Richter surrendered to American forces in early April 1945, outside a town whose name he never learned. He'd been fighting since 1940, had survived France and Russia and the grinding retreat across Germany. His unit had ceased to exist 3 days earlier, scattered by artillery and airstrikes, reduced to bands of men wandering through rubble looking for someone to surrender to before the whole rotten edifice finally collapsed. When the Americans found him, he was sitting on a roadside, his Kar 98K lying beside him, too exhausted even to raise his hands. They searched him, took his rifle, and gave him water. One of the Americans, a corporal who spoke broken German, asked him questions. How many troops in the area? Any SS units? Where were the last defensive positions? Richter answered numbly, past caring about military security or loyalty to a cause that had died somewhere in the frozen fields of Russia. As he talked, his eyes kept returning to the weapons the Americans carried. Garands, mostly, but several carbines among the squad. Light weapons, easy to carry, able to fire again and again without the endless working of a bolt. The corporal noticed his attention and smiled without humor. Asked him in German what he thought of the carbine now. Richter said nothing, but the answer was written on his face, in the resignation of a man who'd learned too late that mocking your enemy's weapons was a luxury reserved for victors. He'd laughed, once, when intelligence briefings mentioned the American carbine. Had dismissed it as he'd dismissed so many things about the Americans, believing that German discipline and training would overcome any material disadvantage. He'd learned otherwise in the Hurtgen, had the lesson reinforced in the Bulge, and now sat as living proof that wars were won not by the soldiers who fought hardest but by the nations who armed them best. The corporal eventually moved on, leaving Richter to wait for transport to wherever prisoners were sent. He sat through the afternoon watching American columns roll past, trucks and tanks and marching infantry, an endless stream of men and material that spoke to an industrial capacity Germany could never match. Among them walked soldiers carrying carbines with the casual confidence of men who knew their weapons worked, who'd tested them in combat and found them sufficient. They didn't look like Supermen or movie heroes. They looked tired, dirty, worn down by months of fighting. But they were winning. That was the only metric that mattered. In the final accounting, the M1 Carbine would become one of the most produced American military weapons ever made, with over 6 million manufactured during and after the war. It served through Korea and Vietnam, was issued to dozens of allied nations, became a civilian sporting rifle after military surplus flooded the market. But its defining moment, the crucible where it transformed from questionable experiment to proven tool, was those desperate months in Europe when German soldiers learned that 15 rounds beat 5, when firepower overwhelmed tradition, when the old ways of war gave ground to the new. The casualties of the European campaign were tallied with bureaucratic precision. American losses approached 140,000 dead, over 500,000 wounded. German military casualties were far higher, millions killed, wounded, or captured. The bombing campaign had destroyed German cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, reduced the industrial capacity of a nation to rubble. Entire generations were scarred by the experience, trauma that would echo through decades. The price of victory had been paid in blood and treasure on a scale that defied comprehension. Yet within that larger horror were individual stories of survival, of men who lived because they could fire 15 times instead of 5, who held positions because their weapons let them put rounds downrange fast enough to make attackers hesitate. Not all of them survived. Carrying a carbine was no guarantee against artillery or a sniper's bullet or simple bad luck. But enough lived to make a difference, to buy time for reinforcements, to slow German attacks just enough for the larger Allied war machine to grind forward. Private First Class Thomas Hendricks, the Iowa farm boy who'd killed 3 Germans in the Hurtgen forest, survived the war. He came home in late 1945, was discharged with a Purple Heart for wounds that had sent him to a field hospital during the Bulge, and tried to return to the life he'd left. He couldn't. The farm was still there, his family welcomed him back, but he felt like a stranger in a familiar place. Sounds made him flinch. He couldn't sleep without dreaming of forests and gunfire. The transition from soldier to civilian was harder than the transition from civilian to soldier had been. He kept the dreams to himself, buried the memories as best he could, and tried to build a life. Married a girl from town, had children, worked the land his father and grandfather had worked. The carbine he'd carried through Europe stayed in a closet, too painful to look at but impossible to discard. Sometimes late at night he'd take it out, check the action by touch, remember the weight of it in his hands when weight meant the difference between living and dying. Then he'd put it away again and return to bed, to lie awake until dawn thinking about the men he'd killed and the ones who'd died beside him. Corporal Vincent Hayes, the paratrooper who'd held a cellar in Bastogne, stayed in the army after the war. He jumped into Korea with the 187th Airborne, still carrying a carbine, still trusting the weapon that had never failed him. He survived that war too, though the weapon's limitations became more apparent against Chinese light infantry who attacked in mass waves. The heavier 30-06 round of the Garand had more stopping power, that was undeniable. But for Hayes the carbine remained a talisman, proof that he'd survived the worst that war could throw at him. He retired as a sergeant major in 1968, the year the Army finally phased out the carbine in favor of the M16. His last official act was to clean and turn in the weapon he'd carried for 23 years. Sergeant Robert Martinez, who'd held a crossroads at Chinon, never spoke about the war after coming home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.